For decades, when we talk about global power, the only countries that come to mind are always the United States of America, China, Russia, and other Western countries. Africa, if mentioned at all, appeared at the edge of the story. But here is a fact that quietly changes everything. By 2050, 1 out of every 4 humans on Earth will be African. No other region is growing at this scale, and yet most people still think Africa has little influence in global diplomacy. African countries make up more than a quarter of the United Nations voting numbers. On papers, that gives Africa more collective diplomatic weight than any single bloc outside Europe. But how often do we always talk about this? Not only that, the minerals empowering electric cars, renewable energy, and modern weapon systems are sourced from the soil of Africa. Without African cooperation, many global transitions will slow down. So here are 3 uncomfortable questions most people don't ask. If Africa is so poor, why are all major global powers competing for influence in Africa? If Africa is supposedly divided, why does its collective vote keep shaping international outcomes? And if Africa is the future, why is it already affecting global security, trade, and diplomacy today? I promise you, if you watch this video to the end, Africa's place in global diplomacy may look very different from what you were taught in school. For decades, Africa was a place affected by decision, not a place where global decisions are made. Africa today is home to about 1.4 billion people. That is more than Europe and North America combined. Demographic matters a whole lot in diplomacy. When global power think long-term, population size is not a side detail, it is very central. A continent that supplies a quarter of the world population cannot be treated as marginal forever. There is also the issue of sovereignty. Africa is not one country, it is 54 independent countries, each with its own government, interests, and foreign policy. That means 54 embassies to engage, 54 trade relations to negotiate, and 54 votes in international forums. In global diplomacy, numbers like that quietly translates into leverage. Compare this to Europe. The European Union is often seen as diplomatically powerful, but it represents just 27 countries. Africa as a continent has double of that number, and when those states coordinate, even loosely, they become very hard to ignore. That is why diplomatic traffic into Africa has increased so dramatically. Over the past 2 decades, China has expanded its embassy network across the continent of Africa. Russia has reopened or strengthened diplomatic missions. The United States holds regular US-Africa summits. Turkey, India, the Gulf states, and even smaller powers are all increasing engagement with Africa. That level of attention is not charity, it is recognition. Africa is no longer just responding to global politics, it is becoming one of the places where global politics is now shaped. One of the least discussed sources of Africa's diplomatic power, unfortunately, is also one of the simplest, and that is vote. At the United Nations, every country, big or small, gets 1 vote in the General Assembly. That means Nigeria vote equals that of Germany, Senegal vote equals that of Japan. This structure was designed to prevent global politics from being controlled only by the most powerful countries of the world. Africa makes up more than 25% of all the UN member countries. That alone makes it impossible to pass major resolution without at least some African support. That matters more than most people realize. Many important global decisions don't happen in dramatic headlines. They happen through resolutions, motions, procedural votes, and coalition building. In recent years, Africa has often acted as a swing bloc, not fully aligned with the West, not fully aligned with China or Russia. Instead, African countries frequently vote based on their own interests regional priorities, or historical experiences. A clear example came during votes related to war in Ukraine. While Europe and North America largely voted as a bloc, African countries were split. Some condemned Russia, others abstained. A few opposed Western-backed resolution outright. That diversity of position frustrated Western diplomats. This voting behavior reflects a broader diplomacy strategy. Many African governments prefer flexibility over alignment. They remember the Cold War when choosing the wrong side often came with devastating consequences. Today, they are more conscious about being pulled into major power rivalries. That is why global power invests so much effort in Africa diplomacy. High-level visit, development packages, military cooperations, and trade incentives are often aimed at one underlying goal, and that goal is influence in multilateral forums. Votes may seem abstract, but they shape rules, and rules shape market and legitimacy. African voting power doesn't dominate global diplomacy, but it frequently decides margin. And in international politics, margin are often where outcomes are made. If you want to understand why Africa matters a whole lot in global diplomacy, then you need to follow the supply chain. Africa holds an estimated 30% of the world known mineral reserve. This isn't just about oil or gold, it is about the materials that modern economies and industries cannot do without. Take cobalt. Around 60 to 70% of the world cobalt supply come from Democratic Republic of Congo. Cobalt is essential for lithium batteries. The kind of battery used in electric vehicles, smartphones, laptops, and military technology. Without steady access to cobalt, the global transition to electric transport will slow down. Not only that, South Africa dominates global production of platinum also, a key component in catalytic converters and hydrogen technologies. And Guinea holds some of the largest bauxite reserves in the world. Now, bauxite are very critical for aluminium production. Namibia and Niger are important sources of uranium. Zambia is central to copper supply. Africa is indeed a blessed continent. China has manufacturing dominance, but it relies heavily on imported raw materials. The United States has resources, but not enough of the specific mineral required for large-scale green transition. That makes Africa strategically unavoidable. This is why resource diplomacy has intensified. China has invested heavily in mining infrastructure across Africa. Western countries are now trying to de-risk supply chains by diversifying away from single-country dependence, which often means renewed engagement with Africa producers. For African states, this creates both opportunity and risk. The opportunity lies in bargaining power. Resources give leverage in trade negotiation, infrastructure deal, and diplomatic relationship. The risk lies in extraction without value addition, a pattern that has historically benefited external actors more than local economies. In global diplomacy, resources don't just fuel economies, they shape alliances. And as the world reorganizes around energy transition and technology competition, Africa finds itself not at the margin of that story, but at the center. Some form of power come from money, others come from technology or military strength. But one of the oldest and most reliable source of power is geography. And in this area, Africa holds an advantage that cannot be replicated. Africa sits at the intersection of some of the world's most important trade routes. Nearly 90% of the global trade moves by sea, and the large share of that trade passes along Africa's coastline. Africa borders and strategically link the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Red Sea through some of the world's most critical maritime routes. Take the Suez Canal. Around 12% of the global trade flows through this narrow passage between Africa and the Middle East. Even whenever given container ship blocked the canal in 2021, global supply chains were disrupted within days. Shipping costs rose, factories slowed, price increased drastically. That single incident reminded the world how dependent global commerce is on Africa route. Then there is the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, a critical corridor linking Europe to Asia. Instability or piracy in this region doesn't just affect nearby countries, it raises insurance costs for global shipping and slowed delivery time worldwide. That is why so many foreign navies patrol these waters. Africa's strategic geography also explains the presence of foreign military bases. This has nothing to do with local conflict. It is about controlling access to shipping lanes and projecting power across region. Compare this to landlocked regions elsewhere. Central Asia, for example, has resources and population, but limited maritime access. Africa, by contrast, has over 30,000 kilometers of coastline, much of it adjacent to major trade routes in the world. For African countries, geography can be a source of leverage, but only if managed carefully. Ports, transit corridors, and logistic hubs can generate revenue, jobs, and diplomatic influence for Africa. Africa's importance is not just about what it has on the ground or who lives there. It is also about where it sits on the map. And in global diplomacy, location still matters more than many people admit. What global powers are increasingly focused on is not Africa's current income level, but its future economic role. Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. Every year, millions of people move into cities. Lagos, Cairo, Kinshasa, Nairobi, and Addis Ababa are expanding at a rate few Western cities experience, even during industrialization. Urbanization drives demand for housing, transports, energy, food, and technology. By 2030, Africa will have one of the largest working age populations on Earth. Meanwhile, Europe, Japan, and part of East Asia are aging rapidly. A younger population means labor supply, consumer, and long-term market growth. When China invests in African infrastructure, it is not only about raw material, it is also about building trade relationships with future consumers. The same logic applies to American tech companies expanding digital services or European firms investing in renewable energy projects. Africa digital growth is a good example. Mobile money systems like M-Pesa in Kenya emerged long before similar tools became common in some Western countries. Smartphone adoption has accelerated. Internet penetration is still lower than in Europe or North Africa, but the growth rates are much higher than before. Now, compare Africa to Latin America. Latin America has higher average income but slower population growth. Africa's appeal lies in scale and momentum. It is not yet a fully developed market, and that is precisely why global powers are positioning early. For African states, the challenge is ensuring growth translates into local values, jobs, skills, and tax revenue rather than simply consumption without production. Africa's economic importance is not about charity or potential, it is about demand. And in global diplomacy, future demand is one of the strongest negotiating tools a region can have, and Africa, fortunately, is blessed with that. When people think about global security, they often picture major military powers facing off against each other. But many of today's most pressing security issues are not confined to borders, and many of them intersect directly with Africa. Conflict, economic instability, and climate stress in parts of Africa influence migration flow towards Europe and beyond. This makes Africa's stability a core concern for European diplomacy, even if it is not always framed that way. Then there is terrorism. Groups operating in the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and part of Central Africa do not exist in isolation. Weapons, fighters, and funding often move across borders. Instability in one country can spill into several others, creating regional security challenges. Piracy is another example. At its peak, piracy off the coast of Somalia affected global shipping routes. International navy coalitions were formed not because Somalia was strategically powerful, but because instability there had global consequences. It is also why global powers invest in security partnership, training programs, and intelligent cooperations with African countries. The core reality is simple. Global security problems do not stay local, and many of the world interconnected security challenges pass through Africa. Ignoring Africa doesn't reduce risk. Engaging Africa intelligently is one of the few ways to manage it. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Africa's role in global diplomacy is the idea that African countries are simply pulled from one side to another by bigger powers. In reality, many African states are doing something more deliberate. They are balancing power. During the Cold War, much of Africa was forced to choose side, align with the West or the Soviet bloc, often at great loss to Africa. That experience left a lasting lesson. Alignment without leverage can be dangerous. Today, Africa diplomacy reflects that memory. Most African countries now pursue multi-alignment. They trade with China, receive security from Western countries, and maintain historical ties with Europe, and increasingly engage with Russia, India, Turkey, and the Gulf states. This is not indecision, it is strategy. Consider infrastructure. China finance and build road, ports, and railway across Africa. At the same time, African governments negotiate development funding from the World Bank, the Africa Development Bank, and European institutions. On security, countries may work with Western militaries while also purchasing equipment from alternative suppliers. This balancing approach gives African states room to negotiate. If one partner offers unfavorable terms, there may be another willing partner to compete. That competition can improve outcome, although it also requires strong governance. To manage dependence limits option. Africa's diversity of partners, by contrast, increases diplomatic flexibility for the region. This is why Africa's position in international forums sometimes frustrates major powers. African countries may refuse to endorse sanctions, abstain from resolution, or call for dialogue instead of alignment. From the outside, this can look like ambiguity. From the inside, it is autonomy. In a world increasingly divided into rival blocs, countries that can talk to everyone becomes valuable. Africa's diplomatic value is not just in choosing side, but in refusing to be reduced to one. Africa's diplomatic role is not limited to participation. Increasingly, it is about reform. For decades, global institutions were designed around a post-World War balance of power. That balance no longer reflects demographic or economic reality. Africa has over 1 billion people, yet no permanent seat on the UN Security Council. That balance no longer reflects demographic or economic reality. Africa has over 1 billion people, yet no permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Global financial institutions are still dominated by voting structure set generations ago. African leaders are now openly challenging these arrangements. Calls for permanent African representation on the Security Council are no longer symbolic. They are coordinated through the African Union and supported by growing diplomatic pressure. Similar demands are being made within the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, where African countries argue that decision-making power does not reflect those most affected by policies. Africa is also shaping norms around development. Many African states are pushing back against aid models that prioritize short-term relief over long-term capacity. There is growing emphasis on industrialization, regional trade, and infrastructure rather than dependency. What's important here is confidence. Africa is no longer simply asking for inclusion, it is asserting interest. Civil diplomacy changes when large groups stop playing by inherited rules and start questioning them. Africa's growing assertiveness reflects its understanding of its own leverage, which is demographic, economic, and political. Africa's influence grows when it acts together. That is why regional and continental institutions matters a whole lot. The African Union provides a platform for coordinated position on peace, security, and diplomacy. While not perfect, it allows African states to speak collectively rather than as isolated actors. One of the most ambitious projects is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which aims to link over 50 countries into a single market. If fully implemented, it will create the largest free trade area in the world by numbers of participating countries. Why does this matter for diplomacy? That is the question a lot of people have been asking. Let me answer it now. It does, because scale increases leverage. When African countries negotiate individually, they face stronger partners alone. When they negotiate as a bloc, the balance shifts automatically. This is already visible in trade discussions, investment networks, and climate negotiations. Unity also strengthens African voice in global debates about development, debt, and security. It reduces the ability of external powers to divide and bargain separately. This doesn't mean Africa always agrees. Difference remains, but even partial coordination changes the diplomatic equation for Africa. In global politics, unity is not about uniformity, it is about shared leverage, and Africa is learning how to use